The estate stands on a hill overlooking the Hudson River, its stone walls darker than the surrounding trees. Built in the early years of the 20th century, it was designed to last centuries, to declare permanence in a nation still finding its footing among the old powers of Europe. The ironwork is ornate, imported. The gardens were planned by men who had studied in France. Inside, the rooms are vast and cold, even in summer. This was never meant to be a home in the way ordinary people understand homes. It was a monument, a fortress, a statement of arrival. John Pierpont Morgan did not build it himself. By the time the construction began, he was already old, his health failing, his empire so vast that no single building could contain it. But the estate was his in spirit, in ambition, in the unspoken code that governed everything he touched. It was built by his son, who carried the same name and the same expectations, and who understood that wealth of this magnitude required visible proof. The estate was that proof. It told the world that the Morgan family had transcended the scramble of American commerce and entered the realm of dynasties. The Morgan name first rose to prominence not through invention or discovery, but through the patient accumulation of other people's money. Junius Spencer Morgan, the patriarch, was a banker in London during the middle of the 19th century, a time when American railroads were expanding with reckless speed and European investors were hungry for returns. Junius positioned himself as the intermediary, the man who could be trusted to channel European capital into American ventures. He did not build the railroads. He did not lay the tracks or drive the spikes. He financed them, and in doing so, he claimed a percentage of everything they would ever earn. His son, John Pierpont Morgan, learned the trade in his father's shadow. Born in 1837, he grew up in a world where money was already abstraction, where fortunes were made not by producing goods, but by controlling the flow of capital. He studied in Europe, absorbed the manners and tastes of old money, and returned to America with a particular kind of confidence. He did not see himself as a mere banker. He saw himself as an architect of order, a man who could impose structure on the chaos of industrial expansion. By the 1870s, America was a country of incredible productive power and almost no financial regulation. Railroads were being built faster than they could be managed. Steel mills were rising in Pittsburgh. Oil wells were gushing in Pennsylvania. Fortunes were being made and lost in the span of months. Into this disorder stepped Morgan, offering a solution that was both simple and ruthless. He would consolidate. He would merge competing companies into single entities, eliminate waste, reduce competition, and ensure stable profits. In return, he would take control. The process was called Morganization, and it reshaped entire industries. Railroad companies that had been locked in brutal competition were brought under single management. Steel producers were merged into U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. Morgan's role was always the same. He did not manage the day-to-day operations. He sat at the center of the financial web, controlling the flow of credit, deciding which ventures would live and which would die. His power was not visible in the way a factory owner's power was visible. It was abstract, structural, embedded in contracts and debt obligations that most people could not understand. But the people who worked in the factories understood the consequences. When Morgan orchestrated the creation of U.S. Steel in 1901, he brought together dozens of smaller companies into a single entity that controlled nearly 70% of the nation's steel production. The workers who had labored in those smaller companies found themselves employees of a corporation so large that their individual grievances meant nothing. Wages were set centrally. Strikes were crushed with hired security forces. The men who owned the steel mills before the merger were bought out, made wealthy beyond measure, and retired to estates of their own. The workers remained workers, their conditions largely unchanged, their voices unheard. Morgan's wealth grew not from production, but from the reorganization of production. Every merger, every consolidation, every bond issue generated fees and commissions that flowed into his bank. By the turn of the century, he was not merely rich. He was a nexus of economic power, a man whose decisions affected millions of lives, most of whom would never know his name. The estate on the Hudson was built during this period of maximum influence. Its construction required hundreds of laborers, most of them immigrants, men who had crossed the Atlantic in search of work and found themselves hauling stone and timber for a family they would never meet. The records do not preserve their names. The archives of the Morgan estate contain detailed inventories of furniture, art, and imported tile, but the men who built the walls are anonymous. This is not unusual. It is the standard practice of wealth at this scale. The estate exists as a testament to vision and taste, and vision and taste, in this context, are credited to those who paid, not those who labored. Inside, the estate was furnished with objects that told a particular story about power and legitimacy. There were paintings by European masters, acquired not for their beauty alone, but for the pedigree they conferred. There were rare books, first editions, manuscripts that linked the Morgan family to a tradition of learning and culture that stretched back centuries. There were Chinese vases, Egyptian antiquities, medieval tapestries. Each object was a claim to continuity with the past, a claim to a kind of authority that transcended mere money. Morgan himself was a collector, obsessive in his acquisitions. He did not simply buy art. He amassed it, room after room, vault after vault, until his private collection rivaled those of national museums. Some of it was later donated to institutions, a gesture framed as philanthropy, though it also served to immortalize his name in the cultural institutions of the nation. The Morgan Library in New York still stands, a monument to his taste, his wealth, and his desire to be remembered not as a banker, but as a patron of civilization. But wealth on this scale is never just about taste. It is about control. And control, in the early 20th century, meant controlling not just industries but the very mechanisms of credit and currency. Morgan's greatest demonstration of this power came in 1907 during a financial panic that threatened to collapse the entire banking system. The panic began in October, triggered by the failure of several trust companies that had made risky investments. As news spread, depositors rushed to withdraw their money, creating a cascade of failures. Banks that were solvent one day found themselves insolvent the next, simply because they could not meet the demand for cash. The federal government had no mechanism to intervene. There was no central bank, no lender of last resort. The financial system was a network of private institutions, and when that network began to fail, there was no one to stabilize it except those who controlled the most capital. Morgan was 70 years old, but he took command. He gathered the most powerful bankers in New York into his library, literally locking the doors until they agreed on a plan to pool their resources and prevent further collapses. He decided which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. He orchestrated the infusion of liquidity that stopped the panic. In doing so, he performed a function that, in other nations, would have been the responsibility of a central bank. He was, for a few crucial weeks, the central bank. The crisis passed. The system stabilized. Morgan was hailed as a savior, a man who had used his private wealth to serve the public good. But the episode also revealed the danger of concentrating so much power in private hands. A single individual, accountable to no one but himself, had decided the fate of the nation's economy. It was a power that many found deeply unsettling, even as they acknowledged its effectiveness. In the aftermath, calls for reform grew louder. There were investigations, congressional hearings, proposals for a central banking system that would replace the ad hoc interventions of men like Morgan. He resisted. He testified before Congress, defending the role of private capital, arguing that concentrated power in trusted hands was preferable to government control. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, who had spent his entire life operating in a world where his decisions were final. But the world was changing. The progressive era was gaining momentum, driven by a widespread sense that the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few threatened the democratic foundations of the republic. Journalists were exposing the conditions in factories and slums. Labor unions were organizing. Voters were demanding reform. The very structures that had enabled Morgan's rise were being questioned. Morgan did not live to see the full extent of these changes. He died in 1913, just months before the Federal Reserve was established, creating the central banking system he had opposed. His funeral was a state occasion, attended by dignitaries and mourned by those who saw him as a stabilizing force in an unstable age. But his death also marked the beginning of a slow unraveling, a recognition that the kind of power he had wielded could not be sustained indefinitely in a democratic society. His son, Jack Morgan, inherited the bank and the estate. He was a capable man, educated and trained in the family business, but he lacked his father's commanding presence. He managed the bank through the First World War, financing Allied governments, deepening the Morgan network's entanglement with global politics. The bank emerged from the war even wealthier. Its influence extended across continents. But the nature of that influence was changing. The world after 1918 was skeptical of concentrated power, wary of the invisible forces that had led nations into catastrophic conflict. The estate remained a physical reminder of a particular moment in American history. It continued to function as a private residence, hosting gatherings of the wealthy and powerful, maintaining the gardens and the art collections. But it was increasingly an anachronism, a relic of an age when such displays of wealth were not just tolerated but celebrated. The Great Depression brought a different reckoning. As banks failed across the country and millions lost their savings, the Morgan Bank was scrutinized with new intensity. Congressional hearings revealed the extent to which the bank had profited from the speculation of the 1920s, how it had sold securities to ordinary investors while privately betting against them. The hearings were sensational, the revelations damaging. The Morgan name, once synonymous with stability, became associated with the excesses that had led to economic collapse. Jack Morgan defended the bank, insisting that it had acted legally, that it had followed the rules as they existed, and he was right in a narrow sense. The bank had not broken laws, but the laws themselves had been designed in an era when men like his father wrote the rules. The Depression made clear that those rules had failed, that a system designed to serve the interests of capital had devastated everyone else. New regulations followed. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial and investment banking, limiting the kind of activities that had made the Morgan Bank so powerful. The Securities and Exchange Commission was created to oversee markets and protect investors. The financial landscape was being rebuilt, and the Morgan Bank, while still influential, was no longer the unchallenged center of American finance. The estate, meanwhile, remained largely unchanged. The gardens were maintained, the art was preserved, the rooms were kept in readiness for a family that spent less and less time there. It became a symbol not of living power, but of historical power, a place where the past was carefully curated and the present carefully managed. The Second World War brought new opportunities for those who controlled capital. The Morgan Bank financed the war effort, managed bonds, facilitated the flow of resources across the Atlantic. It was profitable work, patriotic work, work that allowed the bank to rehabilitate its image after the scandals of the Depression. Jack Morgan died in 1943, and the bank passed to professional managers, men who were competent but who lacked the dynastic vision of the Morgans themselves. The age of the banker as titan was ending, replaced by an age of institutions, corporations that functioned independently of the individuals who ran them. The estate became a problem. It was expensive to maintain, difficult to staff, increasingly out of step with the times. The post-war years were marked by a different kind of wealth, more mobile, less tied to physical displays of grandeur. The new, rich bought apartments in cities, vacation homes in discrete locations, invested in art and stocks and offshore accounts. The estate, with its hundreds of acres and its need for constant upkeep, felt like a burden. In the 1950s, portions of the estate were sold off. Land was subdivided, developed into housing for the growing suburban middle class. The irony was not lost on everyone. The estate built to proclaim permanence was being dismantled to make way for the very people it had once excluded. The main house remained, but its purpose was unclear. It was too large for a single family, too expensive to operate as a private residence, too associated with a particular vision of wealth to be easily repurposed. There were proposals to turn it into a museum, a historical site that would preserve the memory of the Morgan dynasty. But museums require funding, and the Morgan family, while still wealthy, was no longer interested in subsidizing a monument to their ancestors. The estate languished, caught between the past it represented and a future no one could quite envision. In the 1960s and 70s, as the country grappled with civil rights, Vietnam, and a growing skepticism toward institutions of all kinds, the estate became a symbol of something darker. It was featured in exposés about wealth inequality, about the ways in which fortunes built on the labor of others were passed down through generations without consequence. Journalists visited the estate, photographed the empty rooms, interviewed former servants who spoke carefully about the family they had served. The narrative was shifting. The Morgans were no longer saviors of the economy. They were exemplars of a system that concentrated wealth and power in ways that most Americans found increasingly unacceptable. The estate itself became difficult to visit. It was gated, guarded, surrounded by legal barriers that prevented public access. This was framed as a matter of privacy, but it also served to shield the estate from scrutiny, to prevent it from becoming a site of protest or critique. The physical isolation mirrored a broader isolation, a sense that the world the Morgans had built was no longer accessible or even comprehensible to most people. Inside, the art collection remained, though much of it had been moved to climate-controlled storage or loaned to museums. The library, once the site of Morgan's command during the 1907 panic, was preserved but rarely used. The gardens, designed to impress visiting dignitaries, were maintained by a small staff who worked without the recognition or wages that might reflect the historical significance of their labor. The estate had become a kind of mausoleum, a place where the past was kept alive not through active use, but through careful preservation. The Morgan Bank itself continued to evolve, merging with other institutions, expanding globally, becoming J.P. Morgan Chase, one of the largest financial institutions in the world. The modern bank bears the Morgan name, but it functions according to logics that would be unrecognizable to John Pierpont Morgan. It is a corporation, answerable to shareholders, regulated by governments, operating in a world where capital flows across borders in milliseconds and where the concentration of power is both more distributed and more opaque than anything Morgan could have imagined. But the estate remains a point of reference, a physical marker of a particular moment in American history. It is invoked in discussions of wealth inequality, of the ways in which fortunes are built and maintained across generations. It appears in documentaries, in history books, in academic studies of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. It is both a specific place and a symbol, a concrete manifestation of abstract forces. The people who built the estate are still largely anonymous. The stoneworkers, the carpenters, the gardeners, the domestic staff who cleaned the rooms and prepared the meals. Their labor made the estate possible, but their names are not recorded in the official histories. This is not an oversight. It is the structure of how history is written, how memory is preserved. The estate exists to commemorate the vision and taste of the Morgans, and that vision and taste are understood to belong to those who commissioned the work, not those who performed it. There have been efforts in recent decades to recover these lost histories. Historians have combed through employment records, city directories, immigration logs, trying to piece together the lives of the people who worked on the estate. Some names have been recovered, some stories have been told, but the archive is incomplete, and it will always be incomplete because the systems that created the estate were not designed to preserve the humanity of those who labored within them. The estate is not open to the public in any meaningful way. There are occasional tours, tightly controlled, offered to donors or academic groups. The general public cannot walk the grounds, cannot see the rooms where decisions that shaped the nation's economy were made. This inaccessibility is defended on various grounds: preservation, privacy, security, but it also serves to maintain the estate as a private monument, a place that belongs to a particular vision of history rather than to the public whose labor and lives made it possible. In recent years, there have been calls to rethink the estate, to transform it into something that acknowledges the full scope of its history. Some have suggested it become a museum not just of the Morgan family, but of the Gilded Age more broadly, a place where the concentration of wealth, the labor conditions, the social movements of the era could all be examined. Others have proposed it be used for educational purposes, a site where students could learn about economic history, about the ways in which financial systems shape societies. But these proposals face significant obstacles. The estate is still privately controlled, and its owners, whether direct descendants of the Morgans or corporate entities that have assumed stewardship, have shown little interest in opening it to broader public use. The legal and financial structures that protect the estate are complex, designed to ensure that it remains within a particular circle of control. Changing those structures would require not just will, but a fundamental rethinking of how we treat historical sites tied to private wealth. The estate stands, then, as a kind of monument to ambiguity. It is impressive in scale and detail, a testament to the possibilities of concentrated wealth, but it is also a reminder of the cost of that concentration, of the lives that were subordinated to its construction, of the democratic principles that were compromised in its defense. It is both a historical artifact and a living structure, maintained and preserved, but for purposes that remain contested. The gardens still bloom in spring. The stone walls still stand against the weather. The rooms are still furnished with objects of extraordinary value. But the estate exists in a kind of suspended state, neither fully alive nor fully abandoned, a monument to a vision of American power that the nation has never quite repudiated and never quite embraced. The Morgan dynasty itself has dispersed. There are still descendants, people who carry the name and inherit portions of the wealth, but they do not wield the kind of centralized power that John Pierpont Morgan once commanded. The financial world has changed. Power is exercised through different mechanisms, through algorithms and global markets and institutional investors. The age of the individual titan, the man who could lock bankers in a room and dictate terms, has passed, but the structures that enable that power remain in modified form. The estate is one such structure. It was built with capital extracted from industries that exploited labor, that operated without meaningful regulation, that concentrated wealth in ways that undermined democratic governance. Those conditions no longer exist in precisely the same form, but the legacy of that era persists. Wealth still concentrates, power still flows to those who control capital. The estate is a physical reminder of how that process works, of what it produces, and of who it leaves behind. There is no simple moral to the story of the Morgan estate. It is not a tale of pure villainy or unambiguous heroism. It is a story about systems, about the ways in which economic structures shape lives and landscapes. John Pierpont Morgan was a product of his time, operating according to logics that were widely accepted among his peers. He built an empire not through cruelty alone, but through a particular vision of order, efficiency, and control. That vision produced stability for some and hardship for others, and the estate stands as evidence of both. The people who visit the estate today, on those rare occasions when visits are permitted, often report a sense of unease. The rooms are beautiful, the craftsmanship extraordinary, but there is something cold about the place, something that resists the warmth of human habitation. This is not accidental. The estate was designed to impress, not to comfort. It was built to declare the arrival of a dynasty, to establish the Morgans as a permanent feature of American life. But permanence is an illusion, especially in a democratic society. The estate remains, but the world it was built to serve has changed. The financial system has been reformed, however imperfectly. Labor has organized, however incompletely. The concentration of wealth is still a problem, but it is a problem that is named, discussed, contested. The estate stands as a reminder what that concentration looks like when it is unchallenged, when it is allowed to manifest in physical form, when it shapes the landscape to its own image. The question of what to do with the estate remains unresolved. It cannot be undone. The labor that went into its construction cannot be recovered or compensated. The wealth that paid for it has been dispersed, invested, transformed into other forms. But the estate persists, a stubborn fact, a structure that demands acknowledgement even as it resists easy interpretation. Some argue it should be preserved as a historical site, a place where future generations can see and understand the forces that shaped American capitalism. Others argue it should be repurposed, transformed into something that serves contemporary needs rather than commemorating past glories. Still others suggest it should be dismantled, that its very existence is an affront to the principles of equality and justice, that it serves no purpose except to glorify a system that caused immense harm. These are not easy questions, and they do not have easy answers. But they are questions worth asking, because the estate is not just a relic of the past. It is a living structure, maintained and preserved, occupying land that could be used for other purposes, representing a vision of American life that continues to shape how we think about wealth, power, and legacy. The estate sits on the hill, overlooking the Hudson River, dark against the evening sky. The lights inside are few, the rooms mostly empty. The gardens are quiet, the gates are closed. It is a place that was built to last, and it has lasted, but its purpose has become obscure, its meaning contested, its future uncertain. This is the story of the Morgan estate. It is a story about wealth and power, about labor and erasure, about the ways in which the past shapes the present and the present struggles to make sense of the past. It is a story that has no ending because the questions it raises remain unanswered, the structures it represents remain intact, and the landscape it occupies continues to bear the weight of all that was built upon it. The estate stands. The name endures. The history is written and rewritten, remembered and forgotten, preserved and contested. And the people who built it, who queened it, who worked in the industries that made it possible, remain mostly nameless. Their contributions acknowledged in the abstract, but not commemorated in the particular. This too is part of the story. This too is part of the legacy. The Morgan estate is a monument, but it is not clear what it commemorates. Power, certainly. Wealth, undoubtedly. But also the costs of that power and wealth. The lives that were shaped and constrained by it. The democratic principles that were tested and sometimes broken in its pursuit. It is a place that demands to be seen, but it resists being understood. It is a structure that declares permanence, but it exists in a state of profound ambiguity. And so it remains on the hill, overlooking the river, a testament to what was built and what was lost, to what endures and what has been forgotten, to the power of capital to shape the world and the power of time to question what that shaping has wrought.